Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Choi Song, and I would like to talk about moral moral philosophical reflection about uh, coronavirus. I think that the coronavirus pandemic uh, has uh, reflection of uh, moral philosophical thinking of COVID-19. So I would like to say about ethics of COVID-19. Uh, so I will have several philosophies of social justice, and first laws. Many Westerners are Lawrence without knowing it. 50 years ago, the Harvard philosopher John Rawls tried to work out how people would construct a just society if the choice had to be made behind what he called the veil of ignorance uh, about whether they will be rich, poor, or somewhere in between, faced with the risk of being the worst of. Rawls posited humans would not demand the total quantity, but would need to be assured of the trappings of modern welfare state, the assurance of basic necessities, and the opportunity to do better would form the foundation for social and political justice and provide the ability for people to assert themselves. Lawrence monumental 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, is now regarded as a clearest moral and intellectual justification for modern center-left mixed economics. But the idea comes from somewhere different. Lawrence was not religious, but his philosophy is essentially in line with the golden rule handed down by the Old Testament prophets and by Jesus, that we should do as we would want to be done by. Some religious leaders have approached the upper dilemmas presented by the coronavirus just as Lawrence would, by thinking treatment of the worst of as a criterion for social action. I hope the lessons we take from our country's experience with the COVID-19 aren't about food or avoiding the spread of germs, wrote Russell Moore, the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention in the New York Times. But about how we treat the most vulnerable amongst us, a pandemic is no time to turn our eyes away from the sanctity of a human life. Pope Francis also invoked sympathy for the most afflicted as he addressed a prayer to an empty Saint Peter's Square. We have realized that we are on the same boat, all of us fragile and disoriented, but at the same time important and needed. All of us called to law together, each of us in need of comforting the other, he has said. Perhaps because of their religious renounces, Lawrence's ideas have guided the approach to the pandemic chosen by the authorities in the Western world. Societies are mobilizing and governments are taking extra powers to mandate uh, claustrophobic lockdown in bid to minimize the deaths and suffering of the weakest. Even those who aren't religious tend to accept the logic of a veil of ignorance. If a person is unwilling to be abandoned, governments are not entitled to give up on them. They must do their best to protect everyone, particularly the weakest. Second, we think utilitarians. Other philosophies produced very different ways of dealing with the epidemic under utilitarianism, most associated with the 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill. Rulers must be guided to the total happiness or utility of all the people and should aim to secure the greatest good for the greatest number. In Victorian Britain, this was a radical creed, and the first utilitarians were passionate liberal reformers. But the utilitarian calculus opens up a new possibility. Then situations such as pandemic, some people might justly be sacrificed for the great good. It would benefit the society to accept the calculated. The arguments goes to minimize the disruption. Explicit utilitarian thinking still seems beyond the pale. Last weekend, the British Sunday Times reported the Dominic Cummings chief advice to Prime Minister Boris Johnson had advocated in private meeting a policy of letting enough people get sick to establish nationwide herd immunity, protect the economy, and if that means some pensioners die, too bad. It caused an outcry and met with an immediate and impassioned denial by Downing Street. Even Cummings, an icon, refused to be attached to such a brutally utilitarian ideas. Mill himself would not have advocated putting money ahead of people's lives, but the utilitarian calculus is not about balancing money and life. If a recession could lead to shorter lives and widespread misery, it is possible that making less of an attempt to save every rest life from the pandemic now could lead to greater total happiness. In the UK, a paper by an academic at the University of Bristol used mathematical techniques developed the measure to cost efficiency of safety measures in the nuclear power industry to calculate the likely savings of human life by different approaches to the virus, and found that 10 months lockdown followed by vaccinations would be best. But it cautioned that this would only create a net saving of life if a reduction in gross domestic product could be kept to 6.4% or less. That paper, broadcast on the BBC, provoked a fiery response from economists, and some research suggests counterintuitively that recessions lengthen lives. Most people find the mere attempt at such a exercise callous, but it's difficult to dismiss it. Governments and insurers do indeed put a national price on human life when setting policy. Most every rest patients be given the utmost care if this plan of action caused greater suffering in the long run. President Donald Trump put it, we can't have the curve be worse than the problem. It's intuitive to view moral problems through a utilitarian lens and then to find outcomes like this distasteful and to reject them because they conflict with the golden rule. If the lockdowns drag on for months, utilitarian ideas may bubble back to the surface. Libertarianism. Uh, the libertarian place in American thought is long and distinguished. Its lineage goes back at least to the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke and the founding fathers, and its modern incarnation gains inspiration from the author Anne Land, who outlined her ideas in novels and essays. For her, man had the right to live for himself, and individual's happiness cannot be prescribed by another man or any number of other men. The most famous libertarian thought experiment was conducted by another Harvard philosopher, Robert Nozick, in a Lee posed two laws. He imagined what kind of a political state would be built and how much personal liberty citizens would surrender if everyone were dropped into a utopian landscape with no social structures. The novelist William Golding gave one answer in The Lord of the Flies. To avoid the descent into violence that schoolboys of Golding's novel endure, those in anarchy, state, and utopia reckoned that people would set up a very limited state dedicated to the self-defense and the protection of individual rights, but nothing more. The Western coronavirus responded has hugely expanded the state powers and limited individual rights with little debate. And to date, populations have consented to privations that Land and Nozick argued they should never accept. But wait, there have been objections to lockdowns of the libertarian base that they infringe on rights. Critics are appearing saying that politicians haven't proven that such drastic measures are necessary. Before the coronavirus, the US suffered the mass epidemic as the result of anti-vaccination activism. Libertarian cause that put parents' right to choose not to vaccinate their children about the state's attempt to defend other parents' right to expect that their own children wouldn't have to mix with unvaccinated peers. Panic buying and hoarding of medical equipment also show that many people are following Land's idea of self-determination and putting themselves first. Such ideas may grow more appearing at new more weeks of self-isolation. In public space around the world, libertarians are in conflict with the state. Social media is full of images of big social gatherings, often the luxurious social settings. If I get corona, I get corona, as the 22-year-old said on video in Florida. At the end of the day, I'm not gonna let it stop me from partying. Oklahoma governor even felt the need to tweet that he was packed restaurant. Libertarians are not only found on political right as the crisis began to unfold. American Civil Liberties Union made a statement stating that civil libertarians must sometimes give away with when it comes to fighting a communicable disease, but only in ways that are scientifically justified. It said the evidence is clear that travel bans and guarantees are not the solution. The right to walk in park look like a pressure point. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was furious to see crowds expressing libertarian sympathies, whether they saw it that way or not, by gathering in parks. In arrogant Cuomo said, it's sad, destructive, it's disrespectful to other people, and it has to stop, and it has to stop now. New Yorkers are organizing to keep the park open. In these conditions, individual choices become freighted with moral significance. How, for example, will society eventually judging behavior like that? The Kentucky Central Land Power, arguably the most prominent libertarian in the U.S., continued to socialize as normal for a week after being told that he had contact with someone who tested positive for the coronavirus. He had no symptoms. Recall that there are many elderly members of Senate. Last weekend, after workout in the Senate gym, he discovered that he had himself tested positive. Last, I would like to consider communitarianism. Yet another approach is based on the notion that everything derives their identify from the broader community. Individual lives count, but not more than community norms. These notions go back to the Greek. But in modern times, philosophy is most widely connected to the sociologist Amitai Etzioni and philosopher Michael Sanders. Sanders' liberalism and the limits of justice is another life post two laws, arguing that justice cannot be determined in a vacuum or behind veil of ignorance, but must be rooted in society. He sets up theory of justice based on common good. Speaking last week, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, Sanders said that the common good is about how we live together in community. It is about two ethical ideas we strive for together, the benefits and burdens we share, the sacrifice we make for one another. It's about the lessons we learn from one another about how to live a good and decent life. The virus has attacked in exactly this place, depriving everyone of life in community, and communitarian ideas are showing themselves across Europe. People on lockdown have arranged to go to their windows and balconies to applaud their national health service. These are seen as bad lucks of a sight. At London's Olympic opening ceremony in 2012, a pageant of Britishers to organizers celebrate the National Health Service with dancing nurses wearing hospital beds. For many countries with a modern welfare state, celebrating and supporting the workers of the public health service is seen as a communitarian duty. This is a critical point of difference with the US, where the expansion of medical care is a hugely contentious issue. Communitarians like Professor Michael Sanders or Michael Waltz of the Institute for Advanced Studies argue that any system of medical provision requires the constraint of a guild of physicians. The coronavirus promised to bring this debate to a head. Communitarianism is also underlies much social conservative thought. When the very conservative Republic Texas Governor Dan Patrick said on Fox News that the rest of the country should not sacrifice itself for the elderly, he was making a communitarian argument, not utilitarian one. No one reaches out to me and said, as a senior citizens, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? Patrick, who is 63, told the host Tucker Carlson, and if that's the exchange, I will live. In this telling, it is the patriotic duty of the elderly not to force privations on the country and make life worse for their grandchildren. Such a communitarian ethic has always resonated within the U.S. Just led Alexis Tocqueville, and it broke on outcry on social media. China practiced another kind of communitarianism after the coronavirus first appeared in Wuhan in January. The people of that city were told to lock themselves in and offer possibly guaranteed for the good of the community and the state, largely identified with the Communist Party. Under Xi Jinping, the party has rehabilitated the Confucian thought that losing justified the obedience to hierarchical and authoritarian but benevolent state, that the notion of the social solidarity remains strong, showed in the discipline with which China and the other Asian nations dealt with the problem. We are all Lordsian now. For now, the approach being adopted across the West is Lordsian. The politicians are working on the assumption that they have a duty to protect everyone as they themselves would wish to be protected, while people are also applying the golden rule as they decide that the should self-isolate for the sake of others. You are all Lordsians now. How long will we stay that way? All the other theories of justice have appeared and may test the resolve to follow the golden rule, but it expects that rules and the golden rule and will out. That is part 3, because religion, even if it is a decline in the West, has had wired into our consciousness, and as the epidemic grows worse and bring the disease with a pure degrees of separated of for everyone, we may well find the notion of loving the neighbor as they self becomes more potent. This column does not necessarily reflect the opinion of Bloom LP and its owners. I introduced the 2020 Bloomberg article, and the author is John Orders. The article is interesting. March 30 is good. I think it's a good article, so I have interest. I think that we should think and reflect about COVID-19, and especially we should think in the standpoint of moral philosophical viewpoint. Thank you for listening my word.